Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. I do have one quick favor before we get to the video that you came here for, and that is very simply this. You see that little red subscribe button below this video? Go ahead, smash that subscribe button. It really does help me. It really does help this channel grow and my audience grow. So go ahead and hit that red subscribe button. And now, here is the video that you came here for. The topic of the week in college basketball, and that is the University of Kentucky. And I know that we have a lot of non-Kentucky fans that listen to this show, and a lot of you have tweeted me, Torres, all you do is talk about Kentucky, blah, blah, blah. They're the biggest brand in college basketball, okay? When Michigan sucked in football every single week, I had to talk about Michigan sucking every single week because that was the biggest topic at the time in the sport of college football. They're one of the biggest brands. They should never be as bad as they were. And I talked about freaking Jim Harbaugh every single week for about 7 straight weeks. And right now we are at this point with the University of Kentucky because they are the biggest brand in college basketball outside of maybe Duke, and they stink. They're just flat out terrible, and they lost again to Louisville on Saturday. Final score was 62-59 in a game where, frankly, Louisville was not very good either. And so if you're not a Kentucky fan, by the way, just fast forward 8, 10, 12 minutes. We'll get through it. We'll talk some college hoops and Brian Harsin. But if you are a Kentucky fan, or if you just like toiling and enjoying the misery of Kentucky basketball right now, stay tuned because we got a lot to talk about. And what was interesting to me is what I just said a minute ago, is that Louisville beat Kentucky 62-59, but it was not a game where Louisville played great. Chris Mack said so after the game. They didn't shoot the ball well. They turned the ball over too much. They didn't get to the free throw line enough. Chris Mack was like, look, man, we didn't even play that well, and he was 100% right, but they get the win, and with the loss, Kentucky falls to 1-6 on the season. And in many ways, I really frankly don't even know what to say about Kentucky that hasn't already been said, but there are a couple things that are new from this game that need to be discussed. And I think the first one is this. I've been holding out hope. I've been holding out belief. I've been holding out this idea that eventually Kentucky will turn it around. And to a degree, I still believe that that is going to happen. But I think we are now officially at the point with Kentucky being 1-6 that a turnaround might not matter. That we have to start talking about realistically, this team is not going to make the NCAA tournament, right? And I get a Kentucky fan sitting there in your car, you're probably thinking, dude, I've known for 3 weeks we're not a tournament team. And I think that is a totally fair opinion to have, but there was always kind of enough left on the schedule where you could overcome this slow start, and if you could just get on a run, you could potentially do enough to be in NCAA tournament consideration. And then as we've seen time and time again, once you get to the NCAA tournament, anything can happen. But when you look at Kentucky right now, when you look at them on December 28th, when you look at them with a 1-6 start, the reality is now, even if they play really well in the SEC, it still might not be enough. You have to remember, we're playing a 27-game regular season this year, so there are not 31 games like there normally are. And in a 27-game regular season, they are 1-6. So you do some very simple math on what they would have to do looking ahead. And if Kentucky had a really good season in the SEC, say like 12-6 in the SEC, right? Like 12-6 in the SEC probably gets you in second place. If they go 12-6 in the SEC from here, guess what? That's still a 13-12 record overall. Does that sound like an NCAA tournament team to you? The answer is probably no, and that is, again, under the assumption, first of all, that Kentucky plays well, which there's no reason to think that they will, and furthermore, that all the games get in. And so now you're talking about a scenario where it's bad enough you're in this hole, but what if 1 or 2 games gets postponed and can't be made up? What if instead of playing 18 SEC games, you only get in 15? How does that affect everything? And so I think when you're looking at the totality of the college basketball season, it is becoming increasingly harder for Kentucky to see the path to an NCAA tournament bid. I would also add, there of course is the idea that they could just win the SEC tournament in March. Well, first of all, there will be no fans or limited fans if there is an SEC tournament. So the biggest thing that Kentucky has going for it, a home court advantage in Nashville, is basically gone. And I think we have to look at the reality that we might just not have conference tournaments, especially in the major leagues. There is no reason for the SEC to put on a conference tournament where you got to bring everybody to one place, you got to quarantine them, you got to test them, then you got to send them on the way to the NCAA tournament. I think we're looking at a future where we're probably going to have many conferences that don't play a conference tournament. And again, I think when the SEC is in position to get 5-6 bids to the NCAA tournament, I think they might just say that's good enough. We don't need to play the NCAA tournament. And so when I look at Kentucky, that's the first big thing. You could, whether it was the loss to Notre Dame, whether it was the loss to North Carolina, the loss to Kansas, you could look at everything and sit there and say, well, if they can just win one game to get on a roll, they'll be okay. Now, even if you play really well over the next 2.5 months, it still probably will not be enough to get you into serious NCAA tournament consideration. So that's the bottom line. That's my biggest takeaway. And I think beyond that, what it really stretches down to is I cannot believe how bad this team is, which I know is not like a big crazy takeaway. But as I watch this team, I think what has stood out to me more than anything else, and I don't think this is an original thought on my part, is that they are the most bizarre team that, frankly, I've maybe ever seen in college basketball, right? Like, there are teams that underachieve where, say, like, nobody plays well. I think back to North Carolina last year. Cole Anthony gets hurt, and they didn't have anybody playing well. And everything was on Cole Anthony when he came back, and he was good enough to get them a few wins, but they dug themselves such a deep hole that it didn't matter because they just weren't very good around Cole Anthony. And what's fascinating about Kentucky right now is that Kentucky, they actually have guys playing well. It's just the role players. It's the guys that are supposed to be coming off the bench. It's the guys that are supposed to be getting 4 points and 4 rebounds that are playing better than the guys that are the stars. You look at Saturday's game against Louisville, Kentucky has a grad transfer from Creighton named Davion Mintz, who was basically going to be, at best, Creighton's sixth man this year. That's why he transferred, because there wasn't an easy path to playing time at Creighton. He's been arguably Kentucky's best player. Finished the game on Saturday with 19 points, and he did it by making 4 of 6 3-pointers. He's been their best player. Jacob Toppin, who is Obi Toppin's brother, for people who do not know, transferred from Rhode Island. He was supposed to redshirt this year. He's probably been Kentucky's second most consistent player. He had 10 points and 6 boards on Saturday. Devin Askew, a true freshman from here in LA where I live, he wasn't great in the second half, but he was a steadying presence in the first half. Oh, by the way, he's a true freshman point guard. It's okay for him to struggle. That does happen, but of course it's heightened at Kentucky because it's Kentucky, and it's heightened at Kentucky because they are losing. And so rather than going into all of the things that Kentucky doesn't do well, which I've talked about on previous episodes, they don't seem to run an offense, they don't shoot the ball, they don't distribute the ball, they turn the ball over too much. I think what it really comes down to is something even simpler than that, right? Like, it doesn't get much simpler in college basketball or basketball in general. Hey, if you take care of the basketball, if you distribute it well, if you don't turn the ball over, you're going to be in most games. But I think it's even simpler than that when you look at Kentucky. When you look at Kentucky, their biggest problem is this. Their role players are playing well, but it's their guys that we thought were going to be stars who have been absolutely terrible. And you look at Saturday's final score, 62-59, like I said, and Kentucky's 3 players that people thought were going to be stars. And again, I know we have a lot of non-Kentucky fans who listen to this show. They had a transfer from Wake Forest, who I am more guilty than anyone of hyping, named Olivier Sarr, who finished with a grand total of 1 point on 0 of 4 shooting from the field. And then they have 2 freshmen who were supposed to be superstars, a kid named Terrence Clark and a kid named B.J. Boston. They combined to go 3 for 15 from the field in Saturday's loss. And so you take the 3 players who were supposed to be stars for this team, 3 of 18 from the field. And it really is that simple. The reason Kentucky stinks is because their best players stink. And so to me, that is the single most surprising thing, not only at Kentucky, but across, I would say, all of college basketball, is that these guys that everyone just assumed, okay, you don't know what you're going to get from the bench players. You don't know what you're going to get from the transfers. You don't know what you're going to get from the freshmen. But the 3 guys you can count on are Olivier Sarr, Terrence Clark, and B.J. Boston. You can't count on any of them. And so let's get into that really quick, because to me, again, it is the single most stunning thing. Now, I will say, in the grand scheme of things, Terrence Clark is a guy that I don't want to say I had less expectation for. I think he actually, even though he has really, really, really struggled, I think he takes less of a blame for this than the other two, and let me explain why. Terrence Clark is a very toolsy player. He's a guy with a lot of athleticism, a lot of upside, and I think everybody kind of understood this kid's best basketball wasn't going to be played at Kentucky, but 6, 7, 8 years down the road in the NBA. So to me, the fact that he's struggling a little bit, I'm not all that surprised by. But I will tell you, I am stunned by Olivier Sarr and Brandon Boston. And so let's get into those two individually, because again, I just cannot believe how bad these guys are. Starting with Sarr, I'll tell you, I'll admit it. Look, on Saturday, I had a bunch of Louisville fans chirping me because they were saying, dude, Torres, you told us this guy, Olivier Sarr, was the best transfer in college basketball. He just finished with 1 point. He stinks. We got the best transfer in college basketball. His name's Carlik Jones, and he's a stud. Louisville fans, you were right. Torres was wrong. Olivier Sarr, in my opinion, was the best player in college basketball that transferred last offseason, and I cannot believe how bad he is. In my defense, I'm somebody that, first of all, I not only look at the box scores, I actually watch the games. And so if you go back to last year, we all know what the stats were. He came from Wake Forest, where his coach was fired, but in a season at Wake Forest, he finished the year about as well as anybody. He had 30 points late in the year in a game against Notre Dame. He had 25 in a game against Duke late in the season. He had 20 in Wake Forest's final game of the season, which was in the ACC tournament before the ACC tournament was canceled. This was a guy that was tearing up the ACC to close last season. And oh, by the way, when he transferred, I actually talked to a Power 5 coach who told me, man, that guy tore us up. He was the best big we faced all year. When he went into the portal, we tried to get him, but Kentucky got to him first. And so, part of me feels responsible for overhyping this kid, for putting unrealistic expectations on this kid. But I think when you look back, and when he was dropping 25 against Duke and 30 against Notre Dame in ACC play, nobody could have seen how bad this kid has been. And I hate to criticize this kid, but he wants to be a professional. Well, guess what? You got to start delivering at the college level. He finished Saturday's game with 1 point. The game before against North Carolina, he finished with 2 points, and he fouled out. And you look at this kid, and I know Kentucky fans are pulling their hair out about this guy, but you guys are right. He doesn't step up. He doesn't play big in those moments. He's one of the older veteran players on this team, and I know he wasn't at Kentucky last year, but there is no excuse for being as bad as he is right now. He flat out stinks. Single-digit scoring in 4 of the last 5 games. He was one of the few guys that you felt like, at the very least, he's going to give you something, and he's giving you absolutely nothing. And so when you look at the disparity even between, say, a Louisville on Saturday and a Kentucky on Saturday, Louisville's best player, Carlik Jones, graduate transfer, 5th-year senior. The guy made every big play down the stretch. I don't know about every big play, but he made enough big plays to get his team a win. Olivier Sarr's on the bench because he stinks. Then there's Brandon Boston Jr., B.J. Boston, who is a freshman, who was a consensus top 5 high school recruit, who is still, I believe, in most NBA mock draft, a consensus top 5 pick. And I'm telling you right now, not only is he not ready for the NBA, he's not even ready for college basketball. If you look at the raw stats, he is Kentucky's actual leading scorer because somebody's got to score, right? But if you look at what he has done, he is struggling in a way that no one could have ever imagined. Again, a consensus top 5 recruit nationally. He's averaging 14 points, which is respectable, but 36% shooting, 15% from three-point land. And I am just going to tell you flat out, there is not a single more shocking thing to me than that this kid cannot make open jump shots. Flat out cannot make open jump shots for the University of Kentucky. He was one of the best pure scorers in high school basketball last year. And oh, by the way, he played at Sierra Canyon where LeBron James's son and Dwayne Wade's son played. I went to a ton of those games last year, and he was the best player on the floor every time they took the floor. And it wasn't like they were playing against some punk team. Like, they were playing real teams. They're traveling all over the country. They're playing the best teams in high school basketball. And I know it's a step up, but if you can score at that level, you should be able to do something at the college level. And instead, he's averaging 14 points on 15% shooting from three. And I keep sitting here saying, eventually the shots are going to fall, but we're now a quarter of the way through the season, and they're still not falling. And so when I look at this team, yes, it is as simple as when your three best players are simply giving you nothing, you're not going to win games. And that's exactly where Kentucky's at. And I do think it creates some bigger picture issues with Kentucky. I will tell you, first of all, I know the frustration of Kentucky's fan base. I know how upset everybody is. And what I would say very quickly is I'm kind of with you on this one. For the first time of the John Calipari era, I am very much questioning if the way that he did it for the last 10 years or 11 years, I guess it is now, is sustainable going forward. And if it isn't, who is he? Who is he as a coach? And is he too stubborn to change what he's doing? Because when he came to Kentucky, it was the one and dones. We're going to recruit the best of the best. That's what he said when he arrived at the University of Kentucky. We're going to recruit the best of the best. And for people who do not know, I wrote a book about the 2010 Kentucky team called One and Fun. You should get it. It'd be a great holiday gift, neither here nor there. But I bring it up because I know that team, I think, as well as anybody. And when John Calipari got to Kentucky, he said, I am going to recruit the best of the best. And his basic thing was, listen, if I can make these kids millionaires, if they can help me win games, it's going to be a symbiotic relationship. They're going to help me win games at the college level, and I am going to help make them millionaires beyond their wildest dreams and get them to the NBA as fast as possible. I am not going to hold them back. And I think in the big picture, that is a really commendable goal. There's just one problem. The sport of basketball has changed. The sport of college basketball has changed. And what Calipari was doing, that blueprint that he had 8, 10, 12 years ago, I just don't think it's realistic in 2021. And we're a week from 2021, so let's say 2021. You got to remember, first of all, the number of true difference makers that can take a program on your back as freshmen. I mean, you could count them on one hand over the last decade. Anthony Davis, Zion Williamson, R.J. Barrett was probably that kind of player. John Wall, Karl Anthony Towns. But there aren't many. There are a lot of really good players that are not players that can put a team on their back in college and elevate everybody else. Ben Simmons was the number one pick in the draft. He couldn't do that. Anthony Edwards was the number one pick in the draft. He couldn't do that. And so, first of all, the number of guys who are even available that are good enough are very limited. To me, it's a lot like the NBA draft, right? The NBA draft, there's a big difference between getting the first overall pick and the sixth overall pick. Most times you're not getting a franchise-changing player with the sixth overall pick, and it's no different in high school basketball recruiting. If you get the 11th and 13th and 14th best players, it's not the same as getting number 1 and number 2. It just isn't. Beyond that, those elite players that can be difference makers, well, let's look at the landscape. Some of them are going to go to the G League going forward. I've heard mixed things about that program. I don't think it's as sustainable and as exciting as people made it out to be. But there's always going to be kids with family members or adults around them that are going to choose money over playing in college. That's just a fact. There's the fact that those kids are now going to different schools. Duke recruits those guys. Carolina recruits those guys. Small schools that are not basketball schools recruit them. I know Georgia's not a small school. It's a bad example, but they're not a basketball school. They're still recruiting Anthony Edwards. LSU was recruiting Ben Simmons. Cade Cunningham is at Oklahoma State. Gonzaga, of all teams, is recruiting those kind of players. And so those players aren't available. And so what I think Calipari has to do is he has to look himself in the mirror and say, I need to stop worrying about just getting the 5 stars. And I need to go after them. But I've also, when I get those 3 and 4 stars, I got to start developing them. And I talked about it on last episode, but it's worth reiterating here because it is such an important point. Calipari has made it a point in his press conferences over the last 2 or 3 weeks to say, I'm doing my best to get my best players on track, which is great. That's commendable. That's what coaching is, instilling confidence in your guys. Here's the problem. You can't not do the same for the 7th, 8th, 9th guy on the bench because you're so busy trying to get the freshmen, the guys that are going to be gone in 6 months. You're so busy trying to get them on track that you're losing the guys that you're hoping to have in year 2, year 3, year 4. And I went over it, but it's worth repeating. Kentucky has had several players over the last couple years that were in the program that Calipari just never gave a fair shot to, who are now at other schools and are having success. A couple years ago, there was a kid named Jamal Baker. And yes, I've talked about Jamal Baker on a few episodes. I'm probably the only national college basketball podcast that has talked Jamal Baker on multiple episodes. But here's the bottom line. He is now at the University of Arizona, and when you look at Arizona men's basketball, he has been one of their best players this season. He's actually, as a matter of fact, their leading scorer, 15 points a game, 45% shooting from 3. If he could do that at Arizona, he could do that at Kentucky too. The problem was Calipari buried him so far on the bench, and he never gave him a shot. And I'm not saying you have to play him over better players. When he was at Kentucky, they had Tyler Hero. You don't play him over Tyler Hero. But what you can't do is bury him at the end of the bench, give him no opportunity at all, and say, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, you got to find the balance, and you have to start developing players because that is my fear for this program. Calipari wants to keep making this excuse of, well, every year I have to start over. Well, part of that's on you, man. Part of that's on you. You're pushing guys out of this program without giving them a fair opportunity, and they're going other places. There should be 2nd, 3rd, 4th year players in this program, but you don't allow that to happen because you're so busy catering to the best players. So look, I've already gone too long. I promised the non-Kentucky fans that I wouldn't do this forever, but it has to be said, and it is so frustrating, and I just got to call a spade a spade. And so when I look at Kentucky going forward, the one thing I will say, there is some saving grace. On Saturday, whether it was because of injury or because of whatever else, Calipari did play the guys that were playing well. Jacob Toppin played like 26, 27 minutes. He was the transfer from Rhode Island who was supposed to be redshirting this year. Devin Askew played a ton. I don't think he's great. I think he's struggling. I do think the bottom line is that he is limited defensively especially, but he's a freshman. That's supposed to be how it is. But you got to play him because if you don't, you lose him, and he transfers. Davion Mintz, the 5th-year senior, played a lot, and so that is the one positive that came out of Saturday is it felt like he finally was willing to play some of the guys who were actually helping him rather than just catering to the stars. But, I don't know what else to say at this point. I've gone on long enough. I've spent basically an episode and a half talking about this, and there are other teams and other sports and other things to talk about. But, man, is it frustrating from a distance. And